12, you started drinking. Do you know why?
I think that probably the main two reasons were to escape, really, the ways that I felt in my mind, and also for connection, really, to help me to connect with the outside world, really.
Right. What was going on in your home life that made you want to escape?
So I'm the child of an alcoholic. My dad was an alcoholic, and he died when I was around 9 years old. And because of the stigma and things around alcoholism, it wasn't something I was ever really able to talk about. So just general emotions, positive and negative, was something I'd never really learnt to deal with.
So you were suppressing them, effectively?
Yeah. So I suppressed a lot of my negative feelings, and so my perception of the world was probably quite different to someone who was, say, sort of healthy-minded and maybe had a more of a balanced home. So that kind of had a negative effect on me, and where I'd suppressed a lot of the stuff, it came out of me sort of sideways as I grew up, you know.
When you look back, do you think you were definitely and deliberately self-harming?
I'm not sure it started off like that. I mean, in the beginning, drink just, you know, changed my life and made things a lot easier for me. And so I started to drink quite a lot, and then obviously my life began to spiral slightly out of control. And by my late teens, I would say I was drinking in quite a self-destructive way.
How much?
How much did I drink? By my late teens, I was drinking. You know, it started off on a Saturday night, and then it was Friday, Saturday, and then it was Friday through Thursday, and I drank to blackout a lot. So, I mean, I drank to the point of not being able to remember a single thing.
And what was your mum doing when this was going on?
My mum was there, and my mum was supportive. But what we used to do when we were young, sort of 13, 14, is I would say I was staying at a friend's house, and we'd often sort of sleep rough, is what we used to call it, and we'd stay down the park drinking all night. So it was something I hid from my family, really.
John, why do you think there has been such a phenomenal rise in incidents of self-harm involving children over the years?
I think it's a big question, and obviously there are complex factors, but I think it's quite hard to be a young person in today's society. There are a lot of increased pressures on young people nowadays at school, with exam pressures. We were talking beforehand about social media and young people having a kind of public persona on social media which might not reflect the reality of their lives. If they're in distress or unhappy, they don't put that out there on the social media, but they have those feelings nonetheless, and they have to express those feelings in some way, and sometimes that can be associated with self-harm. There's also...
Sorry to interrupt, John, but why, you know, you as a psychiatrist with young people, then you will be able to get into their minds in a way that perhaps we can't, but why would self-harming help them, if I can put it like that?
Well, self-harm is a form of communication of distress,
right.
And I think if you find it hard to communicate distress by verbalising, by talking to people, if you feel lonely and isolated and you don't have anyone that you can talk to, you might communicate that distress by self-harming. It's a kind of a way of dealing with unmanageable feelings, and some people might feel better in the short term when they self-harm, but obviously in the long term it doesn't help them, and it's much better to find someone that they can talk to and that can listen to their distress.
And in particular, this rise in self-poisoning. Self-harm is the label for all sorts of very distressing things, but self-poisoning, which can be anything from drinking bleach, for example, to taking, you know, over-the-counter medicine.
Yes, I mean, there are different forms of self-harm. So self-poisoning, as you say, is one form. Self-cutting is another form. Injuring yourself in different ways, swallowing things that you shouldn't swallow, and so on. Self-poisoning does often present to doctors, to the health service, because you need treatment for it to mitigate the effects of it. But self-cutting, for example, is a much more secretive form of self-harm. We think that perhaps 1 in 10 young people self-harm at some point in their lives, but a lot of it is done very much in secret, and people don't talk about it because there's a certain amount of stigma associated with it and shame. But if people can talk about it more, then they're more likely to get the kind of help they need.
Let's bring in Rachel. Rachel, good morning. Thank you very much for talking to us. You're welcome to the programme. Tell us about your teens and early 20s when you self-poisoned.
So I self-poisoned, like you just said, from my teenage years. I had an eating disorder and I was self-harming. And the way that I mostly used to self-harm was through self-poisoning. And that was mostly through over-counter, kind of paracetamol, that kind of thing. And for me, I actually found it more of a hidden way of self-harming. So you could take an overdose and nobody would know. You know, if you didn't tell anybody, if you didn't get any help or present to A&E, then nobody would even know about it. And it didn't leave a mark on my body either.
Right.
But also I found that on the times that I had cut myself or I'd self-harmed in another way, it was much harder to actually ask for help. And often people would ask to see your scars, or they would judge you by how badly you'd injured yourself. But actually, when you self-poisoned, it was actually much easier to try and get some help, because for some reason, people just took you more seriously. And so I think certainly for some of the young people that are doing it now, it's a way of kind of screaming louder, if you like, and a way of actually getting some help and support that otherwise might not be available.
Right. And so when you took tablets or whatever it was, did you get the help and support you were seeking?
It was much easier to get help and support, because if you went to A&E with a cut that didn't need stitches, for example, there's not a lot that they would necessarily do with you. You just sort of get sent home. But if you go to A&E having taken some tablets, then actually you do get some treatment and you do get heard. And it sounds quite manipulative. It sounds a way of manipulating the system. You know, oh, if I take an overdose, then someone's going to talk to me, someone's going to do something. But actually, when you're struggling with self-harm, you are desperate to be heard, and you are desperate for someone to try and reach you and to try and understand what it is that you're going through. And I think for a lot of people it becomes a desperate measure, and it is a way of just trying to get someone to listen to you.
Still incredibly dangerous, however, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, self-poisoning is absolute Russian roulette with your life. I mean, the tiniest of overdose can do the most irreversible damage to somebody's body. And I think that's something that's actually being missed. And I think there's a lot of young people struggling with self-poisoning who are aware that it's a dangerous thing to do, but I don't think they're quite aware of just how dangerous it is. Yeah. And even if you go and present at A&E and if you get some treatment within a couple of hours of taking an overdose, the damage can still be done. And I think we're going to see more and more lives being lost to this unless we can try and reach these young people before they get that desperate.
Can I ask both you, Rachel, and you, Josh, why you found it so difficult to express how you were feeling, and that you chose this dangerous way of expressing how you were feeling? Rachel, if I ask you first.
I think sometimes you experience things, particularly as a young person, that you don't have vocabulary for. So there were certainly times that I felt things, but I didn't have language to back up what I was feeling. So I couldn't say, I'm feeling X, Y, or Z. And words like happy or sad or anxious just didn't cut it. It just didn't cover how it was that I was feeling. And so for me, it was a way of trying to express something that I didn't have language for, that I didn't have the vocabulary for. And sometimes you don't always have the opportunity to talk to somebody either in the way that you really need to. And so it was a way of trying to create that kind of circumstances, if you like, in which I might be able to talk to somebody.
Josh, what would you say?
I think very much like what's just been said, but also we sort of congratulate suppressing feelings, really, because when I wasn't talking about how I was feeling, I was told I was very strong and sort of congratulated for being strong and pulling my socks up and getting on with life. So it was very, very difficult to talk, especially when we're talking about alcoholism and things like that, and there's stigma in society. We learned at school that people who drink too much and do drugs are bad people. So it's something that was very, very difficult for me to talk about, and seen as weak to express that I was struggling with life. And, you know, for me as a young sort of 13-year-old lad, the last thing I wanted to be seen as was weak. So I think we could sort of congratulate people a lot more when they do find the courage to speak up, so that we can be encouraged, people can be encouraged themselves to speak up about how they're feeling and feel like they'll be congratulated for being strong in expressing their weakness rather than...
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
Thank you all very much. Thank you very much, Josh and John and Rachel. Thanks so much for your time. Thanks for coming on the programme.